respected detective is framed for his wife's murder and becomes a fugitive, uncovering a conspiracy that ties his mentor to a ruthless cartel. But in his final showdown, he learns a truth about his wife that changes everything. Santiago Escobar sat motionless in the cold, sterile courtroom, the air heavy with the scent of wood polish and stale coffee. The judge's gavel echoed like a gunshot, silencing the murmur of spectators. His mind reeled, struggling to absorb the words he never imagined he would hear. Guilty of murder in the first degree. Lucia's smiling face flashed in his memory, her laugh soft and full of life. How had it come to this? His wife dead, his reputation as a respected detective shattered, now condemned to a life sentence for a crime he didn't commit. The guards escorted him roughly from the courtroom, their grip firm as if sensing he might resist. But Santiago didn't. His strength had been drained by weeks of relentless accusations and fabricated evidence. He stumbled into the prison transport van, the doors slamming shut with finality. Outside, reporters shouted questions, their cameras flashing like lightning in a storm. Inside, Santiago sat in silence, his fists clenched, the wheels of betrayal turning in his mind. The reality of prison hit him the moment he stepped into the gray, soulless corridors. Hostility radiated from the other inmates, their eyes assessing him like wolves sizing up prey. Word of his past as a detective had spread, making him a target. Within hours, he felt the suffocating isolation of being hated by both the law he once served and the criminals he had pursued. Santiago's cellmate was a wiry man named Rojas, whose scarred face hinted at a lifetime of trouble. Rojas kept to himself, rarely speaking beyond cryptic remarks. "You'll learn the rules here soon enough," he muttered one night, his voice tinged with something that felt like pity. Days turned to weeks. Santiago endured threats, whispered slurs, and the occasional shove in the yard. The walls of the prison seemed to close in, amplifying his despair. He replayed the trial in his mind, combing through the moments when his world unraveled. The damning piece of evidence, a blood-stained knife supposedly found in his car, was a blatant plant. But who had orchestrated such a betrayal? And why? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the prison yard, Rojas approached Santiago with an urgency that cut through the monotony. His hands trembled as he slipped a folded scrap of paper into Santiago's pocket. "Read it when you're alone," Rojas hissed, his eyes darting nervously to the guards. Back in his cell, Santiago unfolded the note with a mix of skepticism and desperation. Scrawled in hasty, uneven handwriting were the words, "They framed you to silence her." His breath caught. It wasn't much, but it confirmed what he'd suspected. Lucia's murder wasn't random. She had uncovered something dangerous, and her death was meant to bury it. The revelation sparked a fire in Santiago. He couldn't let this injustice stand. But before he could press Rojas for more information, the man was gone, transferred to another facility overnight without explanation. Santiago felt the tightening grip of fear. Someone powerful was pulling the strings, ensuring loose ends were tied. The final blow came 2 nights later. Santiago woke to the sound of muffled voices outside his cell. A shadowy figure approached, their face obscured by the dim light. A makeshift blade glinted in their hand. Santiago's instincts kicked in, honed from years as a detective. He dodged the attack, grappling with the assailant. The fight was brief but brutal, ending with the attacker slumped unconscious on the cold floor. The guards arrived moments later, their batons raised. Santiago raised his hands in surrender, his knuckles bloodied. They dragged him to solitary confinement, a punishment for defending himself. Alone in the darkness, Santiago realized he couldn't survive long in this place. His enemies had infiltrated every corner of his life, and their reach extended even here. But he wouldn't go down without a fight. The note in his pocket was a beacon, guiding him toward the truth. He resolved to escape, to expose the conspiracy that had stolen everything from him. As the days passed, he began to plan, his mind sharpening like a blade. This wasn't the end of his story. It was only the beginning. The storm raged against the prison walls, each thunderclap masking Santiago's steps as he moved through the shadows. The plan he had pieced together over endless nights in solitary had been simple, but simplicity was dangerous. One mistake, and he would never see the sky again. Earlier that evening, during a staged power failure orchestrated by bribed guards, Santiago had slipped out of the solitary wing. The prison sirens hadn't sounded yet. He had minutes at best. Rain lashed his face as he scaled the outer wall, his muscles screaming in protest. Years behind bars had weakened his body, but not his resolve. With a final surge of strength, he dropped to the ground outside the prison perimeter, his breath ragged as he landed in the mud. The cold bit through his soaked clothes, but he welcomed it. Freedom tasted like rain and desperation. The first alarm howled behind him, cutting through the storm's fury. Flashlights flared along the prison walls, sweeping the darkness like hunting dogs. Santiago forced his aching legs to move, stumbling across the rugged landscape. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to hide, but hesitation would mean death or capture. He pushed forward, his boots squelching with each step. Ahead, the city lights flickered like distant stars. It was a mirage of salvation. Santiago slid down a hill, mud caking his hands and knees, before darting into the dense alleyways of the city outskirts. The buildings loomed tall and empty, remnants of industry long abandoned. Perfect for a man running out of time. Behind him, the low hum of engines signaled the police were close. Santiago darted into a narrow passageway between two crumbling warehouses, his chest heaving. He pressed his back against the wall, willing himself invisible as headlights swept across the entrance. Voices barked orders nearby, muddled by the rain. "Check everything! He couldn't have gotten far!" Santiago held his breath. A flashlight beam skimmed the walls, grazing his soaked silhouette for half a second. The beam paused. Santiago's heart stopped. A voice crackled through a radio, drawing the officer away just in time. Santiago exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He couldn't keep running forever. He found refuge in an old storage depot, its metal doors rusted and forgotten. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with dust and oil. Santiago sank to the floor, exhaustion pulling at him. His muscles trembled, his hands raw from climbing and falling. A sudden noise made him freeze. Rats scurried across the floor, their presence a cruel reminder of how far he'd fallen. Not long ago, he had been one of the most respected detectives in the city, praised for his sharp mind and unyielding moral compass. Now he was a fugitive. His name spat like a curse. He couldn't let it end here. Santiago forced himself upright, scanning the depot for supplies. His eyes settled on a faded tarp in the corner. Underneath, he found a discarded toolbox and an old coat. He wrapped the coat around his shoulders, its fabric heavy with grease and time, and pocketed a rusted wrench, a weapon if it came to that. As the storm began to subside, Santiago emerged from the depot. The city stretched ahead of him, its streets slick with rain and glimmering under broken lamplights. Somewhere out there, the answers waited. He had a name, Ortega, and a motive rooted in a conspiracy he was only beginning to understand. Santiago melted into the shadows, moving with purpose. First, he needed allies. Then he would follow the whispers of truth, no matter where they led. The hunt had begun. The early morning fog curled between the narrow streets as Santiago walked with his head low and his shoulders hunched under the borrowed coat. The city had awakened, but it paid no attention to a lone figure moving through the alleyways. People hurried past him, their faces hidden under umbrellas, unaware of the fugitive walking among them. Every shadow felt alive, every passing glance a threat, but Santiago had no time to hesitate. He knew where he was going. Carla Jimenez's office was on the second floor of a faded building on the outskirts of downtown, a place where truths too inconvenient for the powerful were often born. Santiago climbed the creaking stairs two at a time, his pulse quickening. Carla was his last chance. If anyone could help him dig into the conspiracy that claimed Lucia's life, it was her. He hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the peeling paint. What if she turned him in? What if his name had already stained her trust? Swallowing his doubt, he knocked sharply. Moments later, the door swung open, and there she was. Carla Jimenez, the journalist who had exposed corrupt politicians and toppled drug rings with her pen. Her sharp, dark eyes narrowed at the sight of him. "Santiago Escobar," she said coldly, her voice edged with disbelief. "You have some nerve showing up here." "I don't have a choice," Santiago replied, his voice hoarse. "I need your help." Carla didn't move. Her eyes flickered briefly to the street behind him before settling back on his face. "You're a wanted man. And you're the only one who might listen," he said quickly. "Please, just hear me out." After a long, tense silence, she stepped aside, motioning him in. "You have 5 minutes." Inside, Carla's office was a battlefield of papers, files, and half-drunk cups of coffee. Santiago sat stiffly on a worn chair, his hands clasped in front of him. Carla leaned against her desk, arms crossed, studying him like an insect under glass. "Start talking," she said. "They framed me," Santiago began, his voice low but steady. "I didn't kill Lucia. Someone wanted her dead to bury something she knew. I don't have all the pieces, but I have a name, Ortega." Carla's expression didn't change. "Comandante Ortega?" Santiago nodded. "He was my mentor, but he turned on me. There's more at play here than just a setup. I need you to help me connect the dots. If I'm right, Lucia's death ties into something bigger, something dangerous." Carla let out a humorless laugh. "You expect me to trust a man accused of murder? You sound desperate." "I am desperate," Santiago snapped, his voice raw. "But I'm telling the truth. You're a journalist. Look at the evidence for yourself." Carla stared at him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face for cracks. Then, with a sigh, she reached for the file Santiago had brought, the only evidence he managed to collect before his world collapsed. Bloodied photographs, falsified reports, and the note from Rojas lay before her like puzzle pieces. Her brows furrowed as she scanned the documents. "Where did you get this?" "From inside. Someone knew what happened and tried to warn me, but they silenced him." Santiago leaned forward, his voice urgent. "I need your help to prove I was framed. You've fought people like Ortega before. You've exposed men like him." Carla's eyes met his, and for the first time, her skepticism wavered. "If this is real, it's dangerous. The kind of dangerous that gets people killed." "I know," Santiago said quietly. "It already has." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant hum of traffic outside. Finally, Carla closed the file, her decision made. "I'll look into it," she said, her tone cautious. "But don't think for a second that I'm doing this for you. If I find out you're lying—" "I'm not," Santiago interrupted. "Thank you." Carla turned to her desk and picked up her phone. "Go. I'll reach out when I have something." Santiago stood, the tension in his chest easing slightly. As he opened the door to leave, Carla called out behind him, "Santiago." He turned. "Don't get caught," she said, her voice softer than before. "If you're telling the truth, you'll need to stay alive long enough to prove it." Santiago gave a slight nod, then disappeared into the city streets once more. For the first time since his escape, he felt a flicker of hope. The truth was out there. Now, they just had to find it. The slums of La Rinconada pulsed with a different rhythm, one of silent agreements and lurking danger. The narrow alleys were a labyrinth where even the bravest feared to tread. Santiago moved cautiously, his eyes scanning every shadow. Beside him, Carla kept close, her camera bag slung across her shoulder as though it offered protection. "You're sure about this?" she whispered, her tone sharper than the jagged edges of the buildings around them. Santiago didn't slow his steps. "The lead points here. Someone knows what happened to Lucia." Their search for clues had led them to a contact, an informant who supposedly had answers about Ortega and his connection to Lucia's death. Carla, ever skeptical, had only agreed after confirming through her network that the area was cartel territory. "Places like this don't give answers freely," Carla murmured. Santiago's jaw tightened. "Then we'll take what we need." They reached a graffiti-covered door tucked behind a crumbling building. Santiago knocked twice, a slow rhythm that matched the signal Rojas had shared. Moments passed, then the door creaked open, revealing a wiry man with sunken cheeks and a look of perpetual suspicion. "Escobar?" the man asked, his gaze darting nervously between Santiago and Carla. Santiago nodded. "You have something for me." The informant ushered them inside, closing the door behind him. The room stank of sweat, old food, and hopelessness. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, swaying as if unsure whether to stay on. "You didn't come alone," the man said, eyeing Carla. "She's with me," Santiago replied firmly. The informant hesitated before pulling a tattered envelope from his pocket. "I shouldn't even be talking to you. The people behind this—" He paused, licking his cracked lips. "They're too powerful. Lucia knew things about a deal between the cartels and politicians. She—" A loud bang cut him off. The door exploded inward, splintering under the force of a boot. Gunmen flooded into the room, their weapons raised. "Move!" Santiago barked, grabbing Carla and diving behind a rickety table as bullets sprayed the walls. The informant crumpled to the floor, his words unfinished, his blood pooling beneath him. Carla screamed, clutching her camera bag as Santiago pulled her toward a back window. "Go!" Carla scrambled through the narrow opening, shards of glass ripping at her jacket. Santiago followed, landing hard in the alley. Shouts erupted behind them, but Santiago didn't stop to look back. He grabbed Carla's arm and ran. The alleys twisted and turned, each corner offering a new threat. Gunfire echoed, bullets ricocheting off walls as Santiago led Carla through the maze. "This way," he shouted, pulling her into a dark passage that reeked of sewage. They stopped to catch their breath, crouching low as the voices of their pursuers grew faint. Carla's hands shook as she clutched her bag. "You said we'd talk to an informant, not get executed." Santiago leaned against the wall, wiping blood from a cut on his temple. "It's the cartel. They knew we were coming." Carla's glare was sharp. "And now someone else is dead." He didn't respond. The image of the informant's lifeless body burned into his mind, another casualty in this war. Santiago inhaled sharply, forcing himself to focus. "We need to get out of here before they circle back. Come on." They emerged on the edge of the district, where the noise of pursuit had finally died down. Santiago's mind churned as they walked, their clothes soaked in sweat and grime. "Lucia's murder ties to something bigger," Carla said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was quieter now, thoughtful. "The cartel's involvement confirms it," Santiago nodded grimly. "And Ortega's at the center of it." They stepped into the light of a nearby street lamp, their faces pale and worn. Santiago turned to Carla, his eyes hard. "I told you this would be dangerous." She met his gaze without flinching. "Dangerous or not, I'm in. We're not stopping now." For the first time, Santiago saw a steely resolve in Carla's expression, one that matched his own. The truth was closer, but the path to uncover it was lined with blood. The city had quieted into a somber lull by the time Santiago and Carla reached a small, decrepit motel on the outskirts. Santiago pushed open the door to their room, the hinges groaning in protest. The space was cramped and smelled faintly of mildew, but it was hidden, far enough from the cartel's reach, at least for now. Carla dropped onto the edge of the bed, her hand still gripping her camera bag like a lifeline. Santiago stood by the window, peering out into the darkness beyond. His body ached from the chase, but it was his mind that bore the heaviest weight. "You should rest," Carla said softly. "We'll need our strength." Santiago didn't respond. Outside, the flickering light of a street lamp cast shadows against the wall, shapes that twisted and danced like ghosts. He closed his eyes for a moment and the memories began to surface, memories he had been trying to suppress. Lucia. She had been his light in a world darkened by crime and corruption. Her laughter, bright and unburdened, used to fill their small apartment. He could still see her standing barefoot in the kitchen, humming as she stirred a pot of soup. "Come sit, Santiago," she'd say, her voice a melody. "You work too much." "You know I can't," he'd reply with a grin, kissing the top of her head. "You'd burn the soup if I didn't supervise." Her laughter echoed in his mind now, cruel in its clarity. Santiago sank into the chair by the window, resting his head in his hands. The loss felt like an open wound that refused to heal. She hadn't deserved this. Her death had been a message, a silencing of someone too brave for her own good. "I failed her," Santiago murmured, barely aware that he had spoken out loud. Carla looked up. "What?" Santiago didn't meet her eyes. "Lucia trusted me to protect her. I couldn't." The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive. Carla studied him for a moment before she spoke, her voice careful but steady. "She trusted you because you're a good man, Santiago. Good men don't always win, but they keep fighting." He glanced at her then, surprised by the conviction in her words. Carla, with her unyielding determination and sharp instincts, had proven stronger than he'd thought. "What did she mean to you?" Carla asked, her tone softer now. Santiago hesitated, the ache in his chest deepening. "She was everything. Lucia believed in me when no one else did. She kept me grounded even when the job consumed me. She gave me hope." Carla nodded slowly as though piecing together a puzzle. "Then don't let them win. Don't let her death be for nothing." Her words struck a chord. Santiago took a deep breath, the heaviness in his chest shifting, grief mixing with resolve. Lucia's memory was not a weakness. It was his reason to fight. The room fell into a quiet stillness. Carla leaned back against the headboard, her exhaustion evident. "Get some sleep, Santiago. We'll figure out the next step tomorrow." Santiago stood, walking over to the small, cracked mirror above the sink. He stared at his reflection, the lines etched into his face deeper than he remembered. For a moment he saw a soldier, not the detective he once was, but the man he had been long ago. Tomorrow, he whispered, his eyes hardening, he would find the truth for Lucia. The first rays of dawn crept through the cracked curtains, painting the walls in pale orange. Santiago's sleep had been restless, haunted by visions of Lucia and the whispers of betrayal. He woke with a start, every muscle tensed. Carla was already up, hunched over her laptop at the small, battered desk. "Anything?" Santiago asked, rubbing the fatigue from his eyes. "Not much," Carla replied, typing quickly. "But I've been digging into Ortega. There's a lot that doesn't add up. A transfer of funds last month, a sudden promotion years ago. He's connected to powerful people." Santiago's jaw tightened. "I need to see him." Carla spun in her chair, her expression sharp. "Are you out of your mind? Ortega will kill you the moment he sees you." "He won't," Santiago said calmly, his resolve clear. "Ortega trained me. If there's anyone who can get close enough to expose him, it's me." An hour later, they parked near the old police headquarters, a towering building that had once been Santiago's home. It loomed against the gray sky, its facade cracked and stained by decades of corruption. Santiago wore a borrowed cap pulled low over his brow. "Stay here," he ordered Carla as he stepped out of the car. "No chance," she shot back. "You're not going in there alone." Santiago didn't argue. There wasn't time. Together, they slipped through a side entrance, the quiet halls echoing with memories Santiago couldn't escape. His chest tightened as they approached Ortega's office, once a symbol of wisdom and trust, now a lair for betrayal. Santiago stopped at the door. "Let me do the talking," he said quietly. Carla nodded. He pushed the door open. Comandante Ortega sat behind a polished oak desk, his uniform crisp and his silver hair perfectly combed. The man barely glanced up. "Santiago Escobar," Ortega drawled, leaning back in his chair. "I wondered how long it would take before you crawled out of whatever hole you've been hiding in." Santiago stepped forward, his voice even. "You set me up, Ortega." Ortega's mouth curled into a faint smile. "Those are dangerous words, son." "Don't call me that," Santiago growled. "I trusted you. You were my mentor, my friend. Why?" Ortega rose slowly, his presence towering. "Why? Because trust is a weapon, Santiago, and you were too blind to see it." His voice was cold, emotionless. "You and your wife dug too deep. You upset powerful people. She had to be silenced, and you made a perfect scapegoat." The words hit Santiago like a punch to the gut. Carla stepped closer, her eyes burning with anger. "You're a monster," she said. Ortega's gaze flicked to her, his expression darkening. "And you're a nuisance. Both of you should have stayed quiet." Before Santiago could react, the door burst open. Armed men flooded the room, their guns drawn. "Run!" Santiago shouted, grabbing Carla's arm and pulling her toward the window. A shot rang out, shattering glass. Carla screamed as they dove through the opening, crashing onto the rooftop below. Santiago rolled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. Ortega's men were shouting behind them, their footsteps growing louder. "We have to move!" he barked, hauling Carla up. The chase was chaotic. Santiago led Carla across rooftops, ducking bullets and scrambling over rusted pipes. They dropped into a narrow alley, panting and battered. Carla winced, holding her side. "We're not going to make it." "Yes, we will," Santiago growled. "We have to." They found shelter in an abandoned workshop, the sound of their pursuers fading into the distance. Santiago collapsed against a wall, blood trickling from a graze on his arm. Carla sat beside him, her face pale but determined. "Ortega's working with the cartel," she said, breaking the silence. He practically admitted it. Santiago nodded, his expression hard. "And now we know for sure, but we're out of time. Ortega won't stop hunting us." Carla looked at him, her eyes resolute. "Then we hit back first." Santiago met her gaze. The words echoed in his mind, igniting the fire he'd thought long dead. For Lucia, for the truth. The sun hung low in the sky, smothered by thick clouds that darkened the city. Santiago paced in the small workshop, his mind racing as the weight of the situation pressed on him. Carla had been gone for hours, too long. What had started as a quick scouting mission had turned into silence. Something had gone wrong. A sharp knock broke his thoughts. Santiago spun toward the door, wrenching it open to find a boy no older than 14 standing there. The kid's face was streaked with dirt, his wide eyes darting nervously. "They have her," the boy said, his voice a whisper. "The cartel." Santiago's heart sank. "Where?" "Warehouse on the docks. They're waiting for you." The boy turned and ran, leaving Santiago frozen for a moment. He knew what this meant. It was a trap, Ortega's or Rodrigo Valdez's. It didn't matter. They wanted him to come for her, and they weren't expecting him to leave alive. Santiago drove through the empty streets like a man possessed, the engine growling as the city blurred past. Memories of Lucia haunted him, her voice, her smile, and now Carla's face joined them, a reminder of how much blood had been spilled because of this conspiracy. He couldn't let her die, not for him. When he reached the docks, night had already swallowed the horizon. The warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking shadow against the water. Santiago parked the car and slid out, the rusted wrench he'd carried for days clutched tightly in his hand. He moved with the precision of the soldier he had once been, sticking to the shadows. Through a broken window, he saw them. Carla sat tied to a chair in the center of the room, her head slumped forward. Around her, a half-dozen men stood, weapons slung over their shoulders. Rodrigo Valdez, the mercenary Ortega had hired, paced with a serpent's patience, a cruel smile on his lips. "She'll bring him," Rodrigo said, his voice echoing. "He's too stubborn not to." Santiago's grip tightened. They didn't know he was already here. The plan formed in seconds, just like the old days. Santiago slipped around the back of the building, finding an unguarded entrance. Inside, the air stank of oil and sweat. He moved silently, disabling a lone guard with a blow to the head before taking the man's pistol. He crouched behind a stack of crates, steadying his breathing as he lined up his shot. 1, 2, 3. He pulled the trigger. The room erupted in chaos. Rodrigo shouted orders as two men crumpled to the ground. Santiago moved fast, firing at another guard while rushing toward Carla. "Stay down," he barked as she flinched, her eyes flying open. Rodrigo lunged, drawing a knife, but Santiago was faster. He swung the pistol hard, knocking the weapon from Rodrigo's grip. The mercenary snarled, grappling with Santiago, their bodies crashing into the crates. Santiago fought with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. Rodrigo pinned him briefly, his hands tightening around Santiago's throat. "You should have stayed buried, Escobar." Santiago's vision blurred, but he forced his knee upward, striking Rodrigo's ribs. The mercenary fell back, gasping. Santiago grabbed the fallen knife and drove it into Rodrigo's shoulder. The man roared in pain, collapsing to the floor. Santiago staggered to Carla, cutting the ropes that bound her. "Can you move?" She nodded, her face pale but determined. "Let's go." He grabbed her arm, leading her toward the exit as distant sirens began to wail. The cartel reinforcements would arrive soon. They sprinted into the cold night air, slipping through the maze of shipping containers toward Santiago's waiting car. As they reached the vehicle, Carla turned to him, her voice shaking. "Why did you come back for me?" Santiago met her gaze, his eyes hard. "Because I won't lose anyone else." The engine roared to life and they sped into the darkness, leaving the warehouse behind. Santiago's hands trembled against the wheel, adrenaline still coursing through him. Rodrigo had been wounded, but Santiago knew men like him didn't stop easily. "We hit them tonight," Carla said, her voice steady despite everything. "No more running." Santiago nodded, his expression resolute. They were past the point of no return. The rain fell in sheets as Santiago approached Ortega's secluded estate, hidden behind high walls and guarded gates. Each step felt heavier than the last, his body aching from wounds that hadn't healed, but his resolve sharper than ever. Ortega had betrayed everything Santiago believed in, and tonight it would end. Santiago slipped through the outer perimeter, taking down two guards with silent precision. The old instincts were alive now, refined by anger and sharpened by grief. He moved through the darkened halls of the mansion, his boots muffled against the marble floor. Ahead, a faint light glowed from Ortega's office. Santiago pushed open the door. Comandante Ortega stood behind his desk, unfazed, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "I knew you'd come," Ortega said, his voice calm. "That stubborn righteousness of yours. It always was your weakness." "No," Santiago growled, his gun steady. "Trusting you was my weakness," Ortega smiled faintly, setting the glass down. "Lucia wasn't innocent, Santiago. She kept secrets, things you wouldn't understand." Don't you dare speak her name, Santiago barked, his finger hovering over the trigger. Go ahead, pull the trigger, Ortega taunted. But you'll never uncover the truth. Killing me won't change anything. Santiago hesitated, his breath ragged. Ortega had always been a manipulator, and his words coiled around Santiago like a snake. But then he remembered Lucia's smile, the life stolen from her, and the fire in Carla's eyes, urging him to keep fighting. Santiago stepped closer, grabbing Ortega by the collar. You're done, he hissed. You'll face justice for what you did. Ortega smirked, but fear flickered in his eyes. Santiago slammed him against the desk, knocking him out cold. The first domino had fallen. The newsroom buzzed with an electric tension as Carla typed the final lines of her article. The headline blazed across her screen. Cartel and political conspiracy unveiled. The death of Lucia Escobar. It was more than a story. It was a reckoning. Santiago paced behind her, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. The files recovered from Ortega's office were damning. Bank records, phone logs, and photographs connecting powerful politicians, Ortega and the cartel. Lucia had died trying to uncover this web of corruption. Now, her voice would finally be heard. Carla hit send. It's done, she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind outside. The world knows. Within hours, the story spread like wildfire. Screens lit up with Ortega's face and names of officials once thought untouchable. The media swarmed City Hall demanding answers. Arrests began. Some politicians dragged out of their offices, others disappearing overnight. Santiago watched it unfold from the safety of Carla's apartment, his battered body slumped on the couch. The truth was out, but victory tasted bitter. Carla sat beside him, her face resolute. You did it, she said softly. We did it, Santiago corrected. A news alert flashed across the screen. Authorities confirm Rodrigo Valdez still at large. Santiago's jaw tightened. Carla noticed. You know he won't stop. I know, Santiago murmured, his eyes darkening. The storm wasn't over. The abandoned shipyard reeked of rust and salt, its silence broken only by the distant crash of waves. Santiago moved through the shadows with purpose, his every step calculated. Rodrigo Valdez was here, waiting to finish what he had started. Carla had begged Santiago not to go alone, but this was his fight. The conspiracy had taken Lucia, ruined his life, and left a trail of bodies. Now it ended. The creak of metal echoed through the cavernous space as Santiago entered the main hangar. Rodrigo's voice greeted him, smooth and venomous. I knew you'd come, Escobar. Men like you can't resist playing the hero. Rodrigo stepped into view, his scarred face twisted into a cruel smile. A pistol gleamed in his hand, but his eyes burned with something far sharper, hatred. This isn't about justice, Rodrigo taunted. It's about vengeance. You're no different from me. Santiago leveled his gun. I'm nothing like you. Rodrigo fired first. Santiago dove behind a stack of crates as bullets tore through the air. The hangar erupted in chaos, the clash of gunfire and footsteps reverberating like a war drum. Santiago moved with precision, using the shadows to his advantage. Finally, Santiago caught Rodrigo off guard. He lunged, disarming the mercenary and sending his pistol clattering across the floor. The two men grappled, fists landing with bone-crunching force. Rodrigo slammed Santiago against a beam, his face inches away. You should have stayed down. Summoning his last reserves of strength, Santiago twisted free, driving Rodrigo into the ground. He pinned him, his fist poised. This is for Lucia, Santiago growled. With a final blow, Rodrigo went limp. Santiago staggered outside, the dawn breaking over the horizon. Justice had been served, but the cost lingered in his chest. Lucia's memory was safe. He disappeared into the light. Sometimes the truth comes at a price, one that demands courage, sacrifice, and an unshakable will to stand up for what's right. Santiago's journey shows us that justice isn't always handed to the innocent. It must be fought for, even when the world seems determined to silence you. But it leaves one lingering question. What would you have done in his place? Would you have risked everything to uncover the truth, or let the shadows win? Click on the video on the screen to continue this journey of self-discovery and uncover more stories that make us question our own choices. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss what's coming next. See you in the next video.